But first, we start here in the United States, where voters in Georgia are set to decide the future of the U.S. Senate. U.S. President Joe Biden's future legislative agenda and possibly the future of a former U.S. President Donald Trump. The winner of the midterm election runoff in Georgia will make history, as whoever wins will be the first African American to be elected from the state to a full Senate term. Democratic Senator Raphael Warnock and his Republican challenger Herschel Walker will clash in a hotly contested runoff after neither of the candidates earned more than 50% in the November 8th midterm election. Herschel Walker is backed by former President Donald Trump. A Walker win would give the Republicans a boost, while a Warnock victory could indicate that Democrats are making inroads in places where they have had difficulties gaining traction in the past.
Can you believe that? He made a lot of money too, didn't he?
But what, if anything, will this poll hold for former President Donald Trump, as many Republican Party members and donors are blaming his continued presence in this year's midterm for underperformance of Republicans? Will this affect his bid for 2024? Well, according to a new survey, Trump trails Florida Governor Ron DeSantis in a new Utah poll of possible GOP contenders for the 2024 presidential race. According to the poll, Ron DeSantis leads in a hypothetical Republican presidential primary at 24.2%. The former U.S. president came third with 14.6%, 2 points below Liz Cheney, who is the U.S. representative for Wyoming. The latest poll indicates Trump's sliding popularity. Another poll by the Marquetta, Milwaukee, Wisconsin, found that DeSantis was backed by the party's nomination by 60% and Trump by 40%, which is clearly a 20-point lead that the Florida governor has taken. But this doesn't mean the Democrats are not doing anything to win the race. The Democrats have called on their best hopes, the most charismatic leader in the Democratic Party, as they say, former President Barack Obama, campaigning in Atlanta last week. The stakes are as high as possible in the Georgia race. According to reports, some $400 million have already been spent in the campaign, and this makes the Georgia race the most expensive in all of the midterms. For more on this, we are joined by journalist Michael Tracy from New York. Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
Good to be with you.
So it seems so much is at stake for Georgia. Some are saying that this is a referendum not only for President Biden's legislative agenda, but once again, to quote Mitch McConnell, candidate quality when it comes to Herschel Walker and perhaps the future of the Republican Party with Donald Trump as its possible leader.
Well, I think it's worth being a bit leery of those sorts of all-encompassing narrative explanations that are ascribed to individual races. Of course, a Senate election in Georgia that's high profile and has national implications could have some bearing on a wider political narrative, but oftentimes that's sort of pundit pontificating. So for instance, the factions of the Republican Party who are either reticent or actively, aggressively opposed to another Trump candidacy are already dug into their positions more or less, irrespective of the outcome in Georgia. They seized upon the midterm election results last month the minute they were in, and the minute that they could be construed as indicting Trump's poor judgment in selecting Republican primary candidates. So even if there were to be a Herschel Walker victory today, it's hard to imagine that those same Republicans who have already kind of committed themselves to that particular interpretation of Trump's performance, all of a sudden reevaluating and becoming supporters of Trump running for a second term or backing his candidacy. And I guess similarly for Democrats, it's funny because once these narrative sort of constructs settle in, it's very difficult to ever dislodge them. And the narrative construct that settled in immediately after the midterms last month for the Democrats is that they very impressively overperformed, right? And Biden was being given lots of credit for his steady leadership or his political savvy. A lot of this is just, frankly, mumbo jumbo, because you can take whatever you want from election outcomes. They're very disparate, and especially this cycle, they've been sort of heterogeneous in terms of the variability of election outcomes and gubernatorial races versus House races versus Senate races in multiple parts of the country. So I apologize if that's not the most scintillating answer, but oftentimes it's just pretty much necessary to dispel some of these easy, oversimplified narrative interpretations.
Yeah, it's remarkable how the bar was set so low for the Democrats in this midterm on the one hand. And on the other hand, I guess, how much they banked on Raphael Warnock. I mean, he really raised more than any other federal candidate in the 2022 cycle. And more African Americans, at least according to polls in Democratic strongholds, went and voted in early elections, dispelling that myth that there is voter suppression regarding Georgia law and all of that. So I guess my next question is, why did the Democrats bank so much on Georgia? Is it because they're hoping that Georgia, perhaps in 2024, will become, a swing state and will flip Democrat again, like in 2020?
Well, in 2020, Georgia had already become a hugely consequential state, right alongside Arizona and maybe Wisconsin as the pivotal states that really tipped the balance of the outcome in Biden's favor. And there was a ton of sort of frenzy around Georgia's vote administration laws, or its election laws essentially, and conspiracies or wild theories proffered about malfeasance in that regard. And either way, Georgia is sort of central now as a tipping point state in the overall sort of American national electorate. So it's not surprising that both parties would devote a large amount of resources to that particular race. But on top of that, Herschel Walker in particular became almost a comically outsized foil for much of the media, where he would be constantly lambasted, mocked. The media would be always on his trail, trying to, fish out old personal scandals. It's funny. I don't know that I've ever heard Herschel Walker give an extensive statement on his position with respect to, say, Ukraine war funding or all manner of other issues, including foreign policy issues. But if you tune into even just a snapshot of the coverage over the past, 2 or 3 months, you'll get a whole host of information about what his relationships were like with his old girlfriends, his son, and all kinds of other gossip and drama. But because Herschel Walker is sort of an unusual figure, especially for Republicans to have nominated in the South, he has the very noticeable Southern drawl. He speaks sort of malapropisms. He has a very distinctive, a regional dialect that he infuses with sort of bizarre colloquialisms at times. That made him a sort of an easy target for national media to kind of swarm as almost a stand-in for Trump, because obviously Trump wasn't on the ballot in 2022. But they could kind of tie him in with Trump, and Trump did endorse him and facilitate his nomination as the Republican Senate candidate, so it's not entirely unfair. But still, Herschel Walker had sort of a celebrity status that lent itself to probably disproportionate animus being directed at him by his political opponents. So that, I think, partly explains it. And also, I mean, Georgia actually is just sort of demographically interesting. It pretty rapidly changed its demographics, or evolved in the past number of years. I mean, not long ago would have been almost unthinkable, or at least difficult to imagine, that a Georgia Senate race could be comprised of a black male Democrat running against a black male Republican. This had been a solid Deep South state where that would have been not particularly a likely outcome, and as most people would have seen it. So I mean, I don't blame people for being interested, but there probably was a bit of an excess focus.
It is very interesting to watch. And I will say, regarding Herschel Walker, if he was a Democratic candidate, then I think the media would have covered him very differently indeed. Michael Tracy, we're out of time. Thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you back on WION, and we'll be watching Georgia very closely.